Employee performance evaluations, when used correctly, can recognize valuable employees and help employees who need help. But used incorrectly can cause some real problems. I'm Dan Ringer, and we'll talk about employee performance evaluations right now on The Law Works.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Closed captioning for The Law Works is made possible by a grant from the Monongalia County Bar Association and by the Dietzler Family Foundation. People helping people.
The Law Works is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and by ALPS, providing protection and peace of mind for West Virginia attorneys and their clients since 1988.
How should performance evaluations be used, and what are the problems with them? My guest is attorney David Morrison. David, thank you for coming back. I think this is your third or maybe fourth time on the show.
It is.
Employee performance evaluations. It seems like a good idea. In fact, the biggest problem that I hear about them from clients or prospective clients is that they're not performed regularly. Aren't they a good thing?
Well, Dan, as you know, I'm a lawyer, and the typical response from a lawyer is, it depends. It depends upon how they're used. They can be a very effective tool to use in the workplace. They can also be the worst nightmare if they're not done properly. So it really depends.
The first time I ran into them as a young kid coming out of college, I went into the military, and not only was I evaluated, but as a brand new second lieutenant, I was asked to evaluate other people. That was not right because I was only, if trained at all, minimally trained, and that's part of the problem with evaluations. But what we found out, my military experience, was that employee evaluations rarely say what they should say, whether they're good or bad.
And that, unfortunately, has been my experience as a lawyer. I represent employers primarily, so I get involved in reviewing performance reviews, both in litigation and prior to litigation, just trying to provide advice to employers. And quite often you see the employers do not use them properly. The biggest problem you have, and I see it over and over and over again, is that the supervisor wants to be a nice guy, and he wants to be a nice guy to the person that he is evaluating, and the supervisor simply is not honest and doesn't provide a completely candid review of the employee's performance. It's issue avoidance at the time, but you have a written document that then goes into the personnel file that does not reflect the actual performance of the employee, and that can be used against the employer later on in litigation, and it often is.
The employee or the written performance evaluation is a different kind of form, it seems, every place you go, but invariably there is some spectrum of performance, ranging, I suppose, from at one end abysmal to at the other end walks on water. What's the problem with that? Why don't you just say it needs help, or needs a lot of help, or is okay, or is outstanding?
When you try to categorize employees into preset categories of bad to good, not everybody fits into those categories neatly, so to speak. And so what I normally recommend is that you have open-ended questions which forces on the form, which forces the employer, the supervisor, to sit down and actually think about what the employee is doing and answer those questions in paragraph form if necessary, or in bullet point form, however. But they're asked to provide examples of what the employee is doing, good or bad, and you're really testing or reviewing the employee's performance. You're not simply given the opportunity to say good or satisfactory with a check mark. You actually have to sit down and think about it and provide honest feedback.
Let's do some role playing here, Mr. Morrison. I am the supervisor of supervisors of employees. And I am concerned that the people I supervise have time to do their jobs, which is to make sure that other people are doing their jobs. And you have recommended to us that we have performance evaluations, and we've asked you to help design the instrument, and you have just told us that you don't want it to be a multiple choice instrument. You want it to be an essay exam. And Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your opinion, and you're a great lawyer. We love you to death. But we can't afford to do that. We've got 150 employees, and the amount of time it would take to write a theme, which is what you're suggesting about each employee, is staggering and impossible. No. And you've probably heard something like this.
I have, and I was giving you the best of all worlds. Obviously, one person wouldn't be evaluating all 150 employees.
No, you might have a large number of people doing that.
Yes, and it does take time. A good performance review system takes time, and the people have to be trained to do it. There are other instruments that have the categories, and those are okay as long as you have some place on there for the employee and the employer to evaluate the performance. I mean, I recommend self-evaluations as well, where the employee actually sits down and goes through his or her job duties and articulates how he thinks or she thinks they're doing on the job. And so employers pick up a lot of information from employees who are being self-critical, and I think it serves a lot of purposes for that.
But as someone who has represented employees and employers in just these kinds of situations, I would have to tell the employee, don't be negatively critical about yourself. It's okay to be critical in talking about how wonderful you are, but you better not write down anything negative, because if you do, your boss is going to use that against you.
That's a concern. I'm trying to foster good communications here. I mean, with the self-evaluation, you are fostering good communications on the work performance of the employee on the various tasks that he or she has to perform. And most employees, quite frankly, are very honest in the way they review themselves.
Most people are.
Yeah,
and that's why the American legal system works, is that most people are honest, and we rely on that.
And it serves several purposes. One, you get feedback from what the employee thinks, how the employee perceives his or her job, assuming that the person is honest, and again, most of them are. And there may be a huge difference. And so it serves as an opportunity for the employer to talk about the employee's perception of his or her work performance. You may need more training. There could be lots of things or reasons why a particular piece of work is not as good as what the employee thinks. Maybe a misunderstanding as to what the job requirement is. It could be lots of things, but you're fostering feedback from the employee, and you're fostering a dialogue between the two, and that's when work performance improves.
I had a situation, I actually saw this situation relatively recently. There's an employee whom I perceived to be a good employee, a hardworking person, but I noticed that this employee was not getting the job done as timely or necessarily as thoroughly as I thought it should be done. And so my question was, what's wrong? I went to the employee, I said, are you having trouble getting your work done? And it's not my employee, it was somebody else's employee. And the answer was, yes, I am. I said, what do you need to make it better? And that particular employee didn't know, and I suggested, would having an assistant make this work better for you? And the answer was, oh, Lord, yes. I've been trying to do that, but nobody will listen to me. And that gave me an opportunity then to go around the employee and say, you know, you might want to look at that, because this is a way to cure that. And sometimes lawyers do jobs like that, and sometimes our help in that area is not encouraged. But still, that's the kind of thing you see if you can get an employee in their own self-evaluation to say, I can't get my job done because I need help.
Right. And Dan, the best system is where you have day-to-day feedback on those issues. You don't wait for one time a year, you sit down with a performance review and fill it out, but there's day-to-day feedback. That's the absolute best system. We're all busy, and we get tied up in our various functions and requirements and responsibilities, and we don't always do everything that we want to do. The evaluation process forces you to do it at least once or twice a year, however often your performance review is.
I don't think I've ever seen it twice a year.
Well, some people have it twice a year. Yeah. You know, they do it in the summer and in the winter, but most employers do it once a year. At least forces you to do it once a year. If you don't have that day-to-day feedback, and you at least are forced to do it once per year. So that's why it's a good thing.
Unfortunately, and I've seen it many times, many big, small too, but big organizations that you would think were regimented so that things happen just bang, 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 exactly on time and exactly the way they should, will go years without doing proper performance evaluations, if they do them at all. Public school systems historically had a great deal of difficulty with that, although I think now most of them are doing it somewhat more regularly, somewhat better. But it was stunning to me when I would have someone come to me, with an employee, with a question about their employment, and I would say, well, how have your performance evaluations been? And the answer is, I haven't had one for the last 5 years. And so if you're going to have them, you ought to use them.
Right. I mean, that almost goes without saying. If you're going to have a performance review system, you have to use it. You have to follow through on it. I mean, it would be bad to have a system that calls for annual reviews and you do them every 5 years. I mean, I don't know how I would ever defend that if I'm in a trial trying to defend a wrongful discharge case on the basis that someone has had poor performance and they've not been told that they've had poor performance. That's a very difficult case to defend.
Well, I suppose the real issue is what's the purpose of a performance evaluation? I can think of several purposes they might be, but is there a single theoretical purpose for these things?
Hopefully, the purpose of a performance review is to improve performance. It's to give feedback to the employee on how the employee is performing. It may be that the employee is doing something absolutely perfectly and you want to pat them on the back for it and give them feedback that that is what we want. Or it may be that there are deficiencies and you want to improve performance. So hopefully the idea is to provide information to the employee and the employee back to the employer on what the employee is doing to improve performance overall. I mean, that should be the goal.
But oftentimes the fact is that performance evaluations are completed to get them done, and they have no significant standalone value. Sometimes the purpose of them is to create a record to justify giving somebody you like more money in the form of a pay increase or a bonus. And sometimes it's to create a record so that when it comes time to kill that employee in the employment sense, to fire them, you've got enough documentation that you can say, okay, I can fire you and here's the reasons why. So employment evaluations performed with a motive other than a pure motive doesn't seem like such a good idea to me.
Well, it depends. I'll go back to the it depends language again. If you have someone who's a poor performer, I'm hoping, as the lawyer defending you, that you have told that person outside of the performance review process. But the performance review at least provides you with written documentation of the problems. I also recommend that the review, that you follow up from a review. If you have someone who is having performance issues, it's noted in the performance evaluation that it doesn't stop there. You then follow up, try to find ways to assist the employee to make them better at whatever they're having problems with. Or if they simply cannot do it, then at least you're starting the process toward showing that you've tried to work with them. And that's important.
Does an employee have the right to complain that they never told me I was doing it wrong, so they can't fire me for doing it that way?
The legal right, no. I mean, we're an employment at will state in West Virginia.
What does that mean?
What that means is that the employer has the right to discharge an employee for no reason at all or any reason at all, as long as it's not an illegal reason, such as their gender or their race. So technically, no, they don't have the right to be told that they're not performing well. I think if you're litigating a case in front of a jury, most juries want to think that the employer has treated the employee fairly. And one way of being treated fairly is to give them an opportunity to improve in the areas where they're deficient.
And in some employment, an opportunity to improve is required. Public employment,
yes.
Frequently.
Yes.
Your supervisor, if your supervisor is unhappy with the way you're doing your job, is required to come and tell you, I'm unhappy with this, and either tell you to fix it, or in some cases, I suppose, has an obligation to help you fix it, and then evaluate you later.
That's correct. There are performance improvement plans that are sometimes required.
But in most private employment, absent a contract giving you a right like that, it doesn't exist. And in most private employment, David said we're an employment at will state. That means that you can be terminated anytime for any reason or no reason at all. The way you get around that is to have a written contract or be the beneficiary of a written contract that a negotiating unit has created for you. For example, if you're a coal miner, there's a UMWA contract. If you're a member of a union shop of any sort, there's usually some kind of written contract. That's what that whole process is about. But otherwise, you don't have any guarantees you're going to be told that you need to change something or should change something or that they want to change something.
There are no guarantees, but it's certainly good management practice to work with employees and try to get them to improve. It's very expensive to go through the training process for employees as well. And most employers take that into account. They would rather have someone improve than discharge that employee and start all over again with somebody else. So they would really rather work with them and try to get them to improve. That's the normal case.
Yeah, and the training process, even for the simplest jobs, the guy who stacks the cans on the shelf, the woman who answers the phone at the front desk, it takes training and it takes monitoring to make sure that these things are done right. And when you've got somebody who's been there for even a little while, to go back to zero takes a lot of hours. Most people don't have any idea the value of a couple of hours of time in training somebody or cleaning up a mess that somebody's made. It can be staggering.
Well, even the cost of hiring. I mean, you may have to go through advertising and the initial training, the drug testing, perhaps, depending upon the circumstances. There are lots of costs associated with hiring. So,
another problem with performance evaluations is consistency. From the same evaluator of numerous employees, but also from people, different evaluators of the same types of employees.
Yes.
You and I may rate somebody, two different people, completely different. They may be performing exactly the same function, exactly the same way.
Inherent in any evaluation is a subjective view of how that person is doing. If you have a system that calls for evaluating someone from 1 to 10, for example, and this is perhaps the easiest example to understand, I might look at someone's performance as a 6 and you think that performance is at an 8 level. And then when you get down to, especially in these economic times with reductions in force that are unfortunately happening, often those decisions are made on the basis of performance. Well, you look at somebody who's an 8 versus somebody who's a 6, you're going to keep the 8 and lay off the 6, and then, but they might be doing the exact same thing. And then it's hard to explain how you can have a distinction between the two of them when you get into a lawsuit. It's difficult.
And even just one evaluator with more than one employee, and when I think of this, I always think of what I refer to as the American Idol model. The first performer stands up and sings, and the judge says, that's the best performance you could possibly have done. That's the best performance I've heard in this competition. The next singer gets up and sings and says, you're the best performer that's been on this stage tonight. And now you're trying to figure out which one of those did the best job. And by the way, they sang different songs, and their stage presence was slightly different, but I didn't object to either one, so who's the best? And you can't quantify that. It's a subjective system that we try to make objective. And the most horrifying part is we'll have 12 categories, 1 to 10, and you'll be 5, 6, 4, 7, 8, 10, and then someone will pronounce that your performance on the average is a 7.6. That has no logical meaning.
It's hard. It's very difficult because especially when you get into workforce reductions. I've seen a number of them where they just simply look at the numbers, and somebody maybe in Pittsburgh or some other state is making these decisions, and they'll look down and they'll say, okay, we need to lay off 7 supervisors and out of the 14 that we have, and we're just going to look up and take we've got this numerical ranking system, we're just going to take the bottom 7. Well, you may have different people doing the evaluations, and how can you judge a 7.6 versus a 7.2, and how can you really explain that? It becomes very difficult.
How do you do it then, Dave?
Well, some employers don't do it. There are some employers who are saying it's just not worth the risk, and they're doing away with evaluations altogether. You really have to structure your evaluation to evaluate the work performance of that particular employee. A one-size-fits-all performance measurement tool usually doesn't work across a system. You need to evaluate, figure out what you want to evaluate from that employee. What are that employee's job responsibilities, and evaluate that. And your form needs to fit what they do. That's the first thing you need to do. Make sure your form is right. And because what is satisfactory on one particular job may not be on another, and it just doesn't work. And you've got to give training to the supervisors. They have to understand the importance of the performance evaluation, what is trying to be accomplished by it. That has to be done. So a lot of time needs to go into training, and then you need to make sure they're honest. And that is so hard when you get to have your good buddy you go fishing with every Saturday morning. That's the person you're evaluating. It's maybe difficult to say he's not doing a good job on something.
Sometimes employers will tell their people, you do not become social friends and companions of your subordinates, the people that you evaluate, the people that work for you. And that's a really hard thing to enforce for one very obvious and simple reason. Most people who get married marry people they have met in school or in the workplace. Yet we have policies, for example, that say married couple can't work for the same employer. Our employment rules, not laws, rules, sometimes defy reality. And that's kind of what we're in here with performance evaluations. You and I can't evaluate somebody the same way. 2 employees with 2 different jobs can't be evaluated the same way. To harken back to the example I gave before, in the military when I was there, we used exactly the same document to evaluate people who filled out forms and kept track of personnel records and people with authority to launch nuclear weapons. You can't have more different jobs than that.
Yeah.
Yet, 2 or 3 years into your career, somebody would say, well, what was your first performance evaluation? And they would both say, oh, I got a 4.7. But the 4.7s didn't mean anything because they were so different. Yet decisions were made on the basis of that number. And that didn't make any sense at all.
Well, and on top of that, Dan, we're in a small state with lots of small communities. You know everybody in the community. It's hard, much more difficult for a supervisor who grew up in that community, went to school with everybody in that community, to then then be very critical of their good friend that they've grown up with. And you can say that we don't want you socializing, but as a practical matter, it just doesn't work in many of our communities.
Well, in lieu of having written performance evaluations, how do you keep track of your workforce?
Well, it is difficult. What you need to have, whether you have a performance review system or not, there needs to be daily interaction with the employees to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing and that you're getting feedback from them. I mean, there's a lot that employers can learn from employees if they'll listen. And so there needs to be a lot of give and take, a lot of feedback going both ways with regard to job performance. And that really is the best way to improve performance across the board.
And that's time consuming.
It is time consuming.
But
there's just no easy fix.
In fact, the Americans with Disabilities Act kind of requires an employer to have that kind of role with regard to employees who have medical kinds of limitations.
That's right.
Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, if you have an employee who has a limitation of some sort and is not getting their job done, it is not up to them to tell you that they can't do their job or that they need help. It is up to you as the employer to go to the employee and say, is there some reason why you're having a problem? And if there is there something that we can do to reasonably accommodate your problem? And then help you design a fix. Help you design a fix. It's up to the employer to go out and identify the cure for the problem, if there is a cure, or to design one. And employee evaluations should, it seems logically, be much the same way. If you're having a problem, let's work together to help me help you.
You just described the so-called interactive process, where the employee and the employer are supposed to get together and talk about the limitations, and how they can be accommodated so the employee can work. It's the same. It works the same way. It really does. It's all in communication.
David Morrison, thank you for being with us yet again. Thank you also for being with us. On behalf of the LawWorks, I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. If you want to know if you need a lawyer, you can discuss your problems with a lawyer by calling the West Virginia State Bar Helpline, toll-free Tuesday evenings from 6 to 8 at 1-800-642-3617. On the LawWorks webpage at thelawworks.org, you'll find a complete listing of all the LawWorks show topics, information on how to obtain copies of the program, and additional information about this show's topic. You'll also find a list of legal resources that can help answer your legal questions. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future The LawWorks show, you can send us email to thelawworks@comcast.net.
The LawWorks is produced in cooperation with the West Virginia State Bar, the Mountain State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and by ALPS, providing protection and peace of mind for West Virginia attorneys and their clients since 1988.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.